When they leave their country, they're not particularly welcome anywhere else. No one really wants to have them. They're a bit sort of grubby, and um, they come with all the baggage, don't they, of terrible corruption, awful repression. And I suppose it's probably only Vladimir Putin that can stomach him.
The last time I was here on this station was what, September, October? And if you'd have told me then that I would be back here in December and we would be covering the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, I wouldn't have believed you, because the timescale wouldn't have seemed possible. Surely it would take more than 2 months for rebel group HTS to sweep into Damascus and for Assad and his family to flee Syria. But it hasn't taken 2 months. It's taken 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 3 weeks ago, no one was talking about this, certainly in the West. It wasn't anyone's bingo card, was it? The downfall of the Assad regime now, after 24 years in power and 13 years of civil war and his brutal, murderous suppression of his own people. But today, he and his family have, according to Russian media, landed in Moscow. Rebel leader Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani has been addressing cheering crowds in a mosque in Damascus. And the family who have been in power in Syria since 1970 are gone. First, I just wanted to take stock, really, of what's happened today and what might happen next. And I've got 2 great guests to help us with that. Michael Stevens is Senior Fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Hi there, Michael.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for joining us. And Professor Dawn Chatty is Emerita Professor of Anthropology and Forced Migration at the University of Oxford and author of Syria, the Making and Unmaking of a Refuge State. Good evening, Dawn.
Good evening. How are you, Ollie?
I'm well, thank you. And thank you for joining us too. Well, let's start with you, Dawn. What does this mean, this event, for the people of Syria?
Well, I think for most of the people of Syria, this is an astonishing day. Everybody I've talked to is ecstatic. They feel today is a day to celebrate not just 13 years of terrible oppression, death, but actually 54 years of brutal dictatorship. So today is the day for celebration. And as most of my colleagues who I've talked to in Damascus, in Suwaida, in Homs have said, tomorrow we roll up our sleeves and make sure that we can create the kind of democracy that we had in the 1950s.
But there's really no assurance that that's going to be the case. That ecstatic feeling that you describe, I suppose some people think because there were so many refugees from Syria that perhaps some of those left behind were Assad supporters. But Michael, it's surprising, isn't it, how little resistance there appeared to be from his forces. It happened very quickly.
It's remarkable. I completely agree with what you said. If you'd asked me 3 months ago, would we have seen the end of the Assad regime, which has bludgeoned its way through 13 years of war, more or less subjugating areas back under control and accepting some other areas weren't? But you didn't think they were going to collapse, and then all of a sudden, within the space of really 10 days, everything's flipped entirely. I mean, it's incredible. If you go back to, the Hamas attack of 7th of October 2023, then what subsequently happened with, Israel going into Lebanon, decapitating Hezbollah, the process has been extremely quick. From the moment that Hezbollah was decapitated in Lebanon, Bashar al-Assad's alliance structure around Iran, and of course Russia being distracted in Ukraine, his friends were weakened. Hindsight's always 2020. We could always say, "Oh well, shouldn't we have seen this coming?" But no, I didn't. I didn't think that he was as weak as he was. And now it appears that he has no friends left, apart from possibly an apartment in Moscow. So good luck to him learning Russian.
Yeah. What do you think is going to happen with him, with Assad? What do you think the future holds for him, Michael?
Well, it's like it's like all of these dictators, isn't it? Sort of Marcos, who made his departure from the Philippines to the United States, the Shah of Iran. When they leave their country, they're not particularly welcome anywhere else. No one really wants to have them. They're a bit sort of grubby, and they come with all the baggage, don't they, of terrible corruption, awful repression. And I suppose it's probably only Vladimir Putin that can stomach him. So I don't really see a future for the Assad family outside of Russia. They're certainly not going to go to Iran, given that, as you well know, Palestinians who were being protected by the Iranians in Tehran were targeted very easily by the Israelis. So I don't think Bashar would feel very safe there. And I think this is the only option for him.
But what it does mean, Dawn, is that he's not going to be tried in a criminal court, doesn't it, if he's in Russia? And a lot of people in Syria, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm sure a lot of people in Syria would like to see him beheaded, but I mean, an equal number, I'm sure, would like to see him on trial.
Well, yes, but that's going to be pretty impossible unless he decides to travel away from Russia. I just also want to make a point that I think you've misunderstood me. The Jolani has been very, very clever, very, very intelligent, and made it very clear that there is no opposition to those people who have remained in Syria and worked in the civil service. That their target, if any, is going to be those in the various intelligence services, and these are many intelligence services. Those who've been disappearing people, torturing people, killing people. That's the target, but not the civil service. The people who didn't leave. You know, in any civil war, any kind of fighting, there are people who, for one reason or another, cannot leave, do not leave, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they support the terrible acts of the dictatorships. So I just wanted to make that quite clear. The other thing I also want to say is, it seems to me that the press is already kind of sentenced Jolani, somebody who for the last 4 or 5 years has been trying to distance himself from the original organization that he was involved with, which is the Islamic State. He has made it very, very clear in his first pronouncement, and I could read the whole thing out to you, but it hasn't been covered by the press.
No, but well, don't read us the whole thing, but do give us a flavour. Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'll give you a flavor of it. You know, he says that under oath, he pledges to preserve the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria, to protect all Syrian citizens and their property, regardless of their affiliation, to rebuild the state and state institutions on the basis of freedom and justice, to pursue comprehensive national reconciliation and the safe return of refugees and forcibly displaced people in dignity, and to hold accountable any person who has committed crimes against the Syrian people in accordance with due process and in pursuit of justice. And we affirm that the new Syria will not be the exclusive fief of anyone. Syria will be a homeland for all Syrians. This is not being picked up by the press, which is much, much more concerned that he is going to create a new Islamic State. And I think, we've got to give this person a chance, which is something that certainly Israel, Netanyahu, is not doing by continuing to bomb Damascus today, both the military airport and the security and research complex in Kafr Susi. I mean, Netanyahu could have done that last week, 2 weeks ago, or he could have waited a week or two to give this man a chance to work with all of the different opposition groups, because, as you know, Damascus was really taken by local oppositions coming in from the south, not necessarily part of the Hayat Tahrir Yani Sham. So there are a lot of opposition groups that are trying to work together now, but it seems like in the West we've already kind of judged them that, we've got to make sure that they don't become terrible Islamists instead of, jumping out of the frying pan into the fire type thing. And I think, let's give this group a chance. I mean, it's many different groups trying to work together to rebuild Syria, to invite all the 5 million that are outside of Syria to come back and work towards that rebuilding.
I suppose, I mean, that's because, if that's true, Michael, that this Islamist group, HTS, is trying to distance itself, as Dawn was saying there, from Al-Qaeda, from Islamic State. But is that just... I suppose people feel they've been burned before by this, specifically with the Taliban, right? Saying they're all for women's rights and then doing something totally opposite to that once they're back in power. That this is just spin. Do you think that is, as Dawn's saying, unfair? Or do you think it is based on, experience we have dealing with regimes like that?
So one thing I think is we need to make clear is that the conditions in Syria are quite different from that of Afghanistan. And although Afghanistan is a diverse country, Syria is more diverse, and it also borders a lot more countries which have been interfering in its business. So whatever happens, Mr. Jalani's hands are slightly tied by the impact of external powers, and maybe we'll talk about that a bit longer later. But the key thing I want to say here is fundamentally, Jelani is presenting himself as a Syrian. The thing about Al Qaeda and ISIS, or Islamic State as they then called themselves, is that they presented themselves as borderless, right? They could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Global jihad was a phenomenon that could be in your neighbor's house, right? You could be radicalized on a computer, or you could be fighting an insurgency in Iraq, or you could be in northern Libya, or you could be as far flung as Nigeria or Mozambique. You actually have ISIS in Mozambique. Jelani is saying, I'm a Syrian, and my solutions that I'm presenting are for Syrians. I'm going to deal with Syrians. And I think that's been a very persuasive narrative that he's managed to get across to other rebel groups. He's partly got the Turks on side as well, I think. And there is, even the Kurds. The Kurds came out. Saleh Muslim of the PYD, which is the Kurdish main party in Syria, said, we can work with this guy. And the Kurds are leftists. They're mostly atheists. And they're not saying that if they're not prepared to do some business with Jelani. Now, look, I come from a slightly more hesitant background, I think, than Dawn does. I worked in the government on the listing of the predecessor to HTS, which was JFS, Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, and I thought that was actually, to switch to the English language, a bit of a sham. I thought it was Al-Qaeda simply wrapping themselves in a different label and pretending they were something they were not. Then they rebranded again to HTS. I think the proof will be in the pudding. Let's see what Jelani does. Let's see if his actions back up his words. I think that we all need to see how and in what ways he engages with all components of Syrian society.
Yes.
But they are showing
actually,
him goodwill.
Sorry to talk over you, but just on that, Dawn, because we've only got 1 minute left, you alluded to the different groups within Syria when you quoted his statement. I mean, there are Sunnis, there are Shias, there are Alawites, there are Christians as well. Assad is an Alawite, isn't he? These new guys are going to be Sunni of one kind or another. What implications might that have?
I really think we need to give this man a chance to bring all the opposition together. There are many Alawite who were not supporting the regime, but they were silent. I mean, you have Druze, you have Alawite, you have Shia. Certainly the Sunni element is probably, it was once about 70%, but I think most of those 5 million who fled were Sunni, so perhaps it's a smaller number still in the country. You have a very diverse country, but you have a very diverse country that's always been very proud of being Syria. And I think that's what he's going to be working on.
Okay.
If I've only got a minute, I do need to say one thing. Because,
if you could, briefly, thank you.
Yeah. We're talking geopolitics, but I've just received a really frightening message from a former student of mine who is in Sueda, but has been involved and I'm just going to say to you, she's very concerned about she's saying that there are hundreds of thousands of detainees in the Sadnaya prison and other underground prisons that are in danger of death because the oxygen levels in these underground prisons that sometimes go down 3 floors, the generators have all been turned off, because the administrators of these prisons have all fled. In some cases, they can't open the doors because there's no electricity. The generators aren't working. It's a very she's saying it's a very urgent matter to find a way, a contact, an organization that can help restart these generators in these prisons so that they can release these thousands and thousands of prisoners. And I think she's got a point. We're all looking at something, at what's going to happen, in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But
yes, but think about the people that are there right now. I appreciate that point.
Now, if generators can't be turned back on.
Thank you. Professor Dawn Chatty there from Oxford University and Michael Stevens from the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We'll have to leave it there just for time, but thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure